As something of a personal tradition, every summer I reread the Picatrix, partly because I anticipate noticing or learning something new on every reread, and partly because it's kind of expected to have a deep familiarity with this text specifically if you're at all involved in astrological magic. The Picatrix is a relatively short book and a quick read that many modern practitioners of astral magic continually refer back to throughout every stage of their practice. It has attained a status of must-read and is basically the Bible of astrological magic. But what actually is in the Picatrix? Where did this come from? And how much of what it contains is actually practically useful for a modern practitioner? The Picatrix is a text of astral magic, rituals, and recipes, first written in Arabic as the Kayat al-Hakim, or the Goal of the Sage, sometime around the late 950s. It was then translated into Castilian Spanish in the year 1256 in the court of King Alfonso X. We are not 100% sure when it was then translated from Spanish into the Latin version, but scholars suspect that this translation must have been completed by the year 1300. In the Spanish and Latin tradition, Picatrix serves both as the name of the text and its author, while contemporary scholars have landed more firmly on the identity of the author of Picatrix as Abu al-Qassam Maslama ibn al-Qasimi Ibrahim al-Qurtubi al-Sayyat, who lived in the Iberian Peninsula. Currently, there are two English translations that are important to astrologers. There's the Warnock-Greer translation, and there's the newer Atral-Porca translation. Both of these come from the Latin versions of this text, and while they are both good translations in their own, the Warnock-Greer translation has clearer astrological instructions than the Atral-Porca translation, which has clearer instructions when it comes to the identification of different materials that are being worked with. There is currently a translation from Arabic in progress, but there is another earlier translation that's completed by Attila and Kaisel in 2002. This translation's astrological instructions are laughably unclear, which is really a shame as the Arabic Yat and the Latin Picatrix are not exactly the same book. Due to the censorship of the Spanish translators, the Picatrix removes or edits several passages that are heavily Islamic, such as quotes directly from the Quran, which are often changed to sort of comparable biblical quotes unless they're just removed entirely. References to homosexuality are gone, and more. As a result, the Arabic Yat is actually a little bit longer than the Latin Picatrix, though both contain the same number of chapters. Circling back around to the laughably unclear astrological instructions part, the Arabic translation from Attila and Kaisel instructs us to make a talisman as follows. A talisman for such a purpose is made in the hour of Mars, when the moon is in Scorpio. Bring as much misfortune as you can to the ascendant, as well as to its master. Okay, we're following along so far. Also, bring misfortune to the house of faithfulness, and let the ascendant master be connected to the house of destiny. Additionally, bring misfortune to the house of the ascendant and into the house of faithfulness, which will be connected to a misfortune in Al-Rabi or in Al-Sabi. Bury the talisman outside the city. The Warnock-Greer and Atral-Porca versions offer easier to understand instructions, telling us to have the moon in Scorpio, afflict the ascendant and its lord, as well as the fourth house, which is the house of destiny, by putting a malefic there and having it connect with the ascendant or its lord. This is a common theme in Attila and Kaisel translation from Arabic, a general misunderstanding of the houses, specific aspects, and other more technical areas of astrological technique get confused. Hopefully, the newer effort to translate the Arabic Yat will be more readable for astrologers. So we talked about the history and authorship of the book and some of the differences in contemporary translations, but what kind of material does the book actually contain? Well, the contents of Picatrix are not good, and I mean it is not good in several ways. The first and perhaps most striking for first-time readers is that the contents are not palatable for modern readership and shifting morality regarding several topics, including ideas like consent and animal materials, which I guess is kind of a form of consent too. The talismanic instruction I talked about earlier is just one of the many examples of cursed talismans or rituals that the Picatrix contains. There are many recipes and rituals discussed in the book that are for directly causing harm to other people or places. Some of this can be recontextualized as protective and warding or for pest control, but literally we are dealing with talismans to cause pain, illness, and sometimes even death to others, to the target. Similarly, when it comes to the massive batch of rituals that are for interpersonal relationships, the majority that are for love or romance are very questionable or downright dismissive of consent. Today, we tend to view love magic as kind of a weird gray area when it comes to the consent of the individual who is not actually doing the ritual work. The most common way that love magic is explained is that you are making yourself more open to love, or attempting to attract someone into your life who fits certain criteria that you believe you are looking for in a partner. That is not how Picatrix handles it. Here we are specifically targeting one person to influence their view of the practitioner. It's a make this person love me kind of situation. Obviously that is not okay and is more difficult to recontextualize into something that would be more useful to contemporary morality. More shocking than the intended utilization of some of the rituals are the materials that are called for many of the talismans or recipes in the text. Almost all of the recipes that are detailed in the book require either animal material, most usually internal organs, that will require the death of the animal to obtain, blood from an unspecified source, human materials, psychoactives, or some combination of any of these things. A popular idea today is that some of these more distasteful ingredients in these ancient grimoires do not actually refer to the animal parts that they literally call for, but to alternative herbal or plant materials that can be utilized with less horror to modern practitioners. While there is some historical evidence of this, and plenty animal parts have of course found themselves used as folk names for various plants or plant parts, it is very unlikely that this was occurring during the time of the Kiat's writing, or that they would have been accurately maintained anyway during its translation. We know this because many of the rituals of Picatrix instruct us to interact with the animal or make it make a certain sound a certain number of times before then sacrificing it and doing something with some organ. That would need to be one really long, really committed, extended metaphor to make any sense. Even in situations where substitutions are used, they are not always better than the thing that they are substituting. One historical list of codes that we can find is in the Greek magical papyri, and this provides the identity for some more fanciful sounding ingredients like the blood of Hestia, the blood of Kronos, or just things like that, and other gods even then, that still include animal or human materials. The list tells us that lion semen is just another name for human semen, great. Or, when something calls for the blood of a hamadrous baboon, what it really needs is the blood of a spotted gecko. So there's a bunch of weird lateral moves. Even if there was a complex system of codes, we can't necessarily count on it to save us from the utilization of animal or human parts, unfortunately. What is more likely is that animal sacrifice was incorporated into many rituals that are recorded in the Giat and Picatrix. This would not be unusual or uncommon given historical religious practices. I do not practice nor really condone the practice of animal sacrifice, but it is important to remember how significant and widespread animal sacrifice has been historically and is even maintained by some today. Whether from the ritual sacrifice of animals in order to read their entrails as a form of divination, the before astrology divination, or the sacrifice of animals to temple gods, it has been a huge part of religious ritual for as long as humans has had anything resembling religion. Today, our attitudes towards animal sacrifice have been heavily impacted by animal rights organizations, which is probably a good thing, but probably more heavily by the media, which is probably a bad thing, particularly in response to the satanic panic of the 1980s. Now we mostly associate animal and human sacrifice with satanic cults, even though there is no evidence of these sacrifices or widespread ritual abuse by organized cults. They have been heavily utilized in mainstream Christianity, with several references to animal sacrifice being found in the Bible, to contemporary Christian terminology, such as being washed in the blood of the Lamb or taking in the blood and body of Christ during the Eucharist. Both of these things sound horrific if you don't know what they're actually doing. So it is difficult to completely wash away the history of animal sacrifice within the context of rituals, even if we, of course, would like to move past it. Even today, animal sacrifice can be found among indigenous peoples and other contemporary practices, but it is very different from the heartlessness and evil that we have kind of been taught to associate it with in the West. Religious practices that developed a sacrificial component and continue to maintain and utilize it today do so while being mindful of the suffering of the animal and sacrifice the animal as quickly and painlessly as possible as per their traditions. There is, of course, a huge difference between an ordained priest who sacrifices a goat whose remains will then likely go on to feed and support that community, and someone who just wants to stab a chicken to death. One fulfills an important link between humans and spirits while honoring the life or lives that must be taken to continue other life, and the other is just a psychopath. As I said before, I do not practice or really condone someone just picking up animal sacrifice. Please don't take that from this. And I don't say all of this to convert people to practicing it. That would be ridiculous. But maybe just to help sort of recalibrate and tone down some of our initial visceral feelings of disgust or discomfort around the topic. While many of us likely see animal sacrifice as an inhumane or barbaric practice, I would argue that it is likely less barbaric than contemporary factory farming methods of livestock cultivation, the nuts and bolts of which most of us are thankfully shielded from. Psychoactive materials are also a common recipe ingredient and may have some overlap here with more contemporary usage of psychoactives in ritual pursuits. For most of the rituals in Picatrix, one is expected to, burn suffumigations or incense to the celestial spirits that you're invoking to encourage them to appear. Some of the materials called for in these suffumigation blends may be potentially toxic and hallucinogenic, making them, of course, harmful. While some may suggest that the usage of these hallucinogenic substances is to break down one's reality or materially centered brain to make one more open to seeing into the spirit world, critics would counter that, of course you're seeing things, you are high. So aside from all of the questionable materials and the questionable, if not downright predatory goals, what is actually in the Picatrix? What is this stuff for? In the introduction of the Astral Emporica translation, there is a helpful section where the authors categorize the many different ritual goals to help provide a better picture to answer this question and paint a portrait of who this work is for. Astral Emporica count a total of 2,323 rituals that they then divide into 14 different categories. Those are then further subdivided to be more specific to their intent, but we're just going to focus on the main 14 categories. The largest group of rituals concerns interpersonal relations. These can range from repairing relationships, having superiors prefer and like you, souring relationships between others, and being predatory, anything you'd possibly need. Another group of rituals concerns health of the body and healing from disease. A third and fourth category, whose division seems, in my opinion, a little artificial, involves the assistance in gaining knowledge and skills. And a separate category for success or skill, specifically with occult sciences like divination and alchemy, but I think there's a lot of overlap there. But moving on, we have a section for apotropaic magic, which involves shielding, warding, or protecting. But here we have another weird division where Astral Emporica have mostly included protection from wild animals or people, like physical concerns, while choosing to put other forms of apotropaic magic, like protecting oneself from curses or malevolent planetary influences, in other categories, even though it's kind of the same thing. We also find rituals for assistance in commerce and wealth, as well as as for concerns related to agriculture or husbandry. Travel, military affairs, and infrastructure form their own unique categories, as well as our final categories, which involve rituals for things like illusions or altering the senses, and then our other category, which catches basically everything else that couldn't be encapsulated previously. So there is kind of a broad layout of the type of goals that Picatrix's ritual magic can help you to achieve. There is definitely something in there for everybody, but how much of it would actually be useful? How much of it would you actually be able to do on your own as the text describes? It's pretty limited, and it's limited partly on the amount of, cat brains and duck livers that you have lying around the house ready to use, and partly on the astrology described in some of the ritual timing. You can't move the planets. But let's take a step back from that and talk more about the general contents of the text. While the translators Astral and Porica have given a really great breakdown of ritual purposes or intents in the introduction of their version of the Picatrix, that type of rundown isn't exactly what I, as a practitioner of astrological magic, am interested in. We can break the Picatrix down in, or divide it up in, probably an infinite number of ways, but there are 3 divisions that I am most focused on. Many of these have direct implications for the applicability or practical usage of information from the text. The first is the division of chapters into those theoretical chapters versus the practical chapters. A second division we might consider is the division of operations as either recipes or concoctions, or as images and talismans. And the third is a division between those rituals that include an astrological timing component and those that do not. We're going to handle these in reverse order. The Picatrix is described as a grimoire for astrological magic. This would lead one to believe that it is full of secrets about the celestial spirits and how to summon them or create talismans used for specific purposes. Picatrix does contain those things, but not as much of the book is actually dedicated to those topics as you might think. During my most recent reread of the Picatrix, I counted 293 unique rituals detailed in the text. This 293 number is much smaller than the 2,323 number counted by Astral and Porica. That's because we're counting different things. I counted the number of individual rituals described as 1 each, while they counted the number of outcomes or purposes described in each ritual as 1 each. If we take the first ritual described in Picatrix, which is a talisman for the first lunar mansion, about which we are told, the sages of India would begin journeys and take medicine when the moon was in this mansion. Place this mansion as a foundation to all the images that you intend to make for those going on a journey so that they come and go safely. Also, this mansion ought to be placed as a foundation to creating discord and enmity between a man and woman, and between 2 friends, so that they become enemies, and also to sow discord between 2 associates, and do this similarly when you wish to cause a slave to flee. This is 1 ritual by my count, but at least 4 ritual intents: journeys, medicine, enmity, and fleeing by Astral and Porica's. I just wanted to take a second to explain why these numbers are so different, but it isn't really super important to the overall point that I'm trying to make. Of these 293 unique rituals, 162 of them contain some sort of astrological timing consideration, whether that is a planet being in a specific part of the zodiac, a specific sign of the zodiac rising, planets needing to be in particular configurations with one another, or even specific days of the week or planetary hours. 162 rituals use some astrological timing mechanism. The remaining 132 do not. This is kind of an uncomfortably close split for a book that is the book on astrological magic. This figure is a little bloated by the inclusion of the lunar mansions and the decans, but the rest are usually planetary or implied planetary in nature. Another important distinction we might consider is the division of the rituals described as being talismanic or image magic based, and those that are more concoction or confection based. The Picatrix comes primarily from the image magic tradition. This is a particular school of magic that uses images or pictorial representations of various things, which are most usually carved into precious stones or metals. This is theoretically based on the same idea as the constellations and signs of the zodiac. The constellations are celestial images made out of groupings of stars that we are only able to perceive in our minds as we connect the stars together like dots in the night sky in different ways. The logical extension here is that there may be other images that are even more subtle, and that if we're able to know what those are and bring them down into the physical world, we can allow those celestial powers to emanate from this material reproduction of that celestial image. The signs serve as a good example of this. We know that the zodiacal signs and the zodiacal constellations are not the same thing. The constellations are the visible star groupings, which are uneven in size, while the signs are mathematical divisions of the ecliptic into 30-degree segments. The signs are invisible and cannot be perceived visually. They must be perceived mathematically, but they contain imagery that is hidden from our usual physical senses. The image of the sign Aries is a ram, Taurus is a bull, Gemini is twins, and when planetary configurations occur in these signs, there is an understanding that it can affect the real-life things that those images represent. So we might worry that a solar eclipse in Taurus, for example, might have some effect on bovine or livestock, such as an increase in mad cow disease. Practitioners of image magic basically reverse engineer this process, for example, creating the image of a scorpion during a particular astrological configuration and performing certain ritual actions. That image could then be used to influence real-world scorpions or other pests, or to copy their characteristics. So it could be used to bring infestations to a specific location, to rid a location of pests and insects, to heal or minimize the pain from an insect bite or sting, or to inflict similar harm to another individual. It's pretty straightforward to see how this process developed out of the utilization of the imagery of the zodiacal signs and even non-zodiacal constellations, but this process of perceiving otherwise imperceptible images from celestial spirits does not stop there. This is also where we get the images associated with the planets, with the lunar mansions, the fixed stars, and the decans. It's just that the processes or the sources of these images are something of a mystery, but are likely either spirit revealed or a mix of astrological symbolism, or maybe even references to different religious iconography. Interestingly, image magic is explained as not powered by its iconography per se, but by the mathematical ratios and geometric relationships that the lines of the image contain that just so happen to form a specific picture, if you can, buy that explanation. So that is the brief rundown on images and image magic in Picatrix. Usually these images are crafted, suffumigated, and consecrated during astrologically auspicious moments to confer to them or awaken in them celestial power. This is different from what I call the concoctions in the Picatrix, which feature no image component and are exclusively focused on the compounding of various plant and animal materials. These are then usually burned as incense, applied physically onto something, or ingested, your typical, mummy dust, black of night, old hex cackle, and scream of fright kind of stuff, but less child-friendly exotic materials and more rooster livers and cat brains, as you do. This line of magical technique appears to be somewhat more alchemical in origin and spirit. These concoctions are explicitly not talismanic, as they are not empowering or awakening materials with celestial energies or spirits. Instead, we are combining, amplifying, or augmenting the supported natural properties of these various and oftentimes odious materials. Picatrix tells us that the reason these compounds work is through their occult properties, which basically just means that they work outside of modifying the four qualities of heat, coldness, moisture, and dryness. So we aren't 100% sure why they work outside of the Aristotelian construct of physics. Just that they do, but the Picatrix suggests that they work because of connections to planetary energies. By my count in Picatrix, there are 255 talismanic images and 229 concoctions described. In this count, I have included images that were described and followed up by a purpose, such as in sections on the images of the decans and lunar mansions, where we're told this is this decan's image, and then this is what it does. I also included what are called orphaned images, those images that are described but lack a specific purpose, such as the planetary images, though I assume the implied use there is that they're supposed to be used for whatever purpose or prayer that somebody might make a petition to a planet that they correspond to. And then finally, there are what I call the nondescript images, where the book simply instructs us to make an image, to accomplish something, but we aren't given any specific image to recreate. The concoctions are more straightforward and have two distinctions. The first is those concoctions which are more incense and suffumigation based and more meant to assist in ritual work. The second are more like medicinal potions, which are to be taken either internally or applied topically. Both are equally gruesome in their constituent parts. Let me be clear, you will not use any of these concoctions. Like, you won't. Trust me, you will not be able to use any of these or then talk yourself into actually using them after you have made them. Honestly, the concoctions are really my favorite part because they're just so out there. One of my favorites is a recipe that's going to make a chicken follow you, and to do this, pay attention everybody, to do this you simply feed it 3 days in a row. Like, yeah, that'll do it. Like, what a great ancient magical secret. Another one that I think is fun is for generating discord and enmity, which tells us, take 3 ounces of black cat's blood, 2 ounces each of pig blood and brain, and 1 ounce of donkey brain. Mix everything together and blend it well. Whoever you have given this medicine to in food or drink will hate you. Like, yeah, fucking bet. Put some brains in my food and we'll see how well we get along afterwards. And this is a good example of what I mean when I say you won't use any of these concoction recipes. Most of them contain gruesome animal products that you can't just go out and get. And if they don't, then they have something that is toxic or psychoactive in it, and rolling the dice on that probably is not worth whatever benefit the potion is supposed to provide to you. And this, I think, is a really important distinction which underlies a lot of why I don't really like the Picatrix as an instruction manual. There is just so much of it that you will not use. Not only are half of the rituals described devoid of any astrological component, but it is also roughly even in images versus concoction. Now, the images you can definitely get some use out of, but the concoctions are too dangerous or outrageous to use. The final division of the book we're talking about is the division of the chapters into those that are theoretical and those that are practical instruction. I think this division is probably the most important because the author of the book himself talks about this distinction between the theory of magic and the practical use of magic. He does not then go on to explicitly divide the content of his book, so I went ahead and took care of that for you. There are 40 chapters in Picatrix, and of them 17 are what I would consider theoretical, while the other 23 are practical. To me, the practical chapters are those that include some kind of instruction, whether that be, instructions on how to make a talisman, how to make any of the concoctions you won't use, or instructions on any kind of astrological timing or manipulation. The theoretical chapters are more background information and discussions on mechanics or metaphysics that explain the worldview that the Picatrix inhabits. Let's walk through this. As I said before, the Picatrix is divided into 40 chapters across 4 books. 40 may have been an intentional choice, as the number 40 does have some significance in Islam. However, the 40 chapters are not divided evenly across the 4 books. The first book contains 7 chapters, book 2 has 12, book 3 has 12, and book 4 has 9. I imagine that there is some special significance to this organization. The first book containing 7 chapters likely corresponds to the 7 classical planets. The second book having 12 chapters may be a reference to the 12 signs of the zodiac, while the 12 chapters of book 3 may be a reference to the 12 zodiacal constellations as separate entities, and the final book's 9 chapters might be referencing the spheres in the Ptolemaic universe. The introduction of the Arabic Qiyat does specifically state that the first book has 7 chapters because that is the number of planets, but offers no explanation for the number of chapters assigned to the other books, so that is just conjecture on my part, who knows. The book does not contain what I would call consistent themes throughout its chapters, nor does it come to natural stopping or transition points. Instead, they just seem to jump around to various topics. All 4 books contain chapters that would be both theoretical and practical. The theoretical chapters mostly focus on the metaphysics at work and the philosophical underpinnings that make magic go. For those of you who are already familiar with traditional astrology, you'll already have a head start on the worldview of Picatrix. Basically, everything happens because of astrology, obviously, and magic is no different. The universe of the Picatrix consists of concentric spheres, with the stationary Earth in the middle, while the other spheres sort of nest around it, each one enveloping the previous. In the sphere of the Earth exists the 4 elements of air, fire, earth, and water, and these elements transform into one another and create everything that exists on Earth. This sphere is special because it is the only place where things can be born, grow, diminish, and pass away. From here we enter the celestial spheres, which are more permanent and immortal, starting with the sphere of the moon, who exists in this kind of weird in-between space. She is the most physical of the immaterial planets due to the variability of her phases. The moon's job is to connect the world of the physical with the world of the spiritual, and it's why she's the most important planet in astrology. She condenses the effects of the other planets and allows them to materialize in the physical world, thus being the reason why astrology works. And she also rarefies and spiritualizes the essences and prayers of our physical world and carries them up to the other planets. After the moon, we have the spheres of the other planets, who, while they have their own sort of unique properties, they're all fairly similar and just follow one after another in the order of average planetary speed. So the moon, then Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. After Saturn, we enter the 8th sphere, which is the sphere of the fixed stars and constellations. They serve as this sort of curtain of night that the planets are able to move around in front of. Finally, our 9th sphere is the sphere of the prime mover, and its job is to move the whole of heaven in one circular motion, making a complete rotation in just 24 hours. It carries the planets and stars on their daily journey, and its most readily apparent job is moving the sun along the sky from sunrise, noon, sunset, and midnight back to sunrise. Beyond the prime mover, there is the Empyrean, which is basically the wider universe beyond our little corner of it, wherein superior spirits and deities reside. It's often associated with or equated to heaven in kind of the Christian context. The creator deity lives here and is doing important creator deity stuff along with his best buddies. That's basically the universal structure that Picatrix operates within. Things higher up have the power to affect things lower down on the totem pole, as it were. The planets operate through rays that they emit down to the Earth's surface that sort of get absorbed by everything on the Earth and reacted to depending on the disposition of that which absorbs it. The universe is, of course, full of spirits that can be petitioned and may potentially intervene in human affairs or help us to renegotiate the fate that we are saddled with in our birth chart. Aside from this kind of physical ordering of the universe, there was also a complementary spiritual ordering that is usually called something like the Great Chain of Being. It is a spiritual hierarchy in which more mundane or physical things lie closer to the bottom, while more spiritual things are higher up at the top, all connected together. The very top link is the One, the creating deity, or force from which all things come and to which presumably all things will return once their time on the earth is up. This link then splits off from this creation deity into 7 distinct chains, each one associated with one of the 7 traditional planets. These chains are then made up of several links which indicate a specific group or class of spiritual beings. According to 15th century astrologer, magician, and Platonist Marsilio Ficino, these links are in the order as follows, with the planets, the daimon or their attendant spirits, people, animals, plants, metals, stones, sounds, and aromas. This is the system that we're working from when we talk about things like planetary correspondences of any kind, whether it's Saturn plants, moon metals, mercurial characteristics, or Venusian occupations. They're all found somewhere along one of these chains. Astrological talismans are created at specific times to make the most out of an astrological configuration. These objects then take on the properties of that astrological moment by taking in its rays and slowly emitting them in the area that they are stored for the duration of the object's existence. There is a little bit of conflicting information in Picatrix about how exactly talismans work and what exactly the metaphysics behind them are. In some sections of the book, it suggests that what we're doing when we're making a talisman is we are waking up a dormant spirit, a dormant shard of a planet, who already exists in whatever material we're working with. This makes the material one of the most significant decisions we'll make in our talisman making or ritual preparation process. If we want to make a sun talisman, then we need to make sure that we are using sun materials that fall somewhere along the chain of the sun in this great chain of being, using a combination of solar plants, metals, images, sounds, and smells ensures a greater connection with the spirit of the sun, and as a result, a more powerful talisman. Elsewhere in the text, it talks about drawing spirits into the talisman. This suggests a process whereby a spirit is invoked, lured into a talisman, and captured inside of it. To the author of the Picatrix, these methods may not actually be that different, and it may just be awkward wording, but the pictures that they end up painting of astrological magic and a practitioner's relationship with celestial spirits are very different. According to one method, you're waking up something that is dormant and connecting it back to its spiritual source to draw power from. And the other, you're kind of just throwing a Pokeball at a spirit, which I assume are all ghost types. This seeming contradiction might also be due to the Picatrix author trying to accurately represent his source material. In the text, we're told the author read over 224 ancient books on magic and kind of condensed them down into one volume as the Qiyat al-Hakim, which then became the Picatrix, which sounds like a flex to read 224 books, but when the resulting book is like 250 pages, what are you going to do? So this is obviously going to result in some internal disagreement if these ideas are coming from separate reference texts. And that's about it for the theoretical information in Picatrix. Those are really the big takeaways of how the magic of Picatrix operates and the worldview necessary for it. If you're interested in learning more about this, I would really recommend reading The Discarded Image by C.S. Lewis, which is a book that I think anyone who is interested in classical astrology should read anyway. Now, the practical side of Picatrix is something that I wanted to spend a little bit of time on, partly because this is where a lot of the astrological instruction lies, and I have opinions, so let's walk through them. Our first practical chapter is Book 1, Chapter 4, and this covers information regarding the 28 lunar mansions, as well as some rules regarding how to handle the moon in these magical elections. The moon is the most important planet, so she gets almost all of our focus in this and really many more chapters. The rules start out pretty simple, like if you want to do magical oriented towards growth or stability, make sure that the moon is configured to Jupiter and Venus, the benefic planets. If you want to watch the world burn, have her configured with Mars or Saturn, who will definitely help you accomplish that. Then we start to get into more rules that sound a little bit more like rules for more mundane utilizations of electional astrology. By this I mean these are not what we would call specific rules for magical applications of astrology, but just general rules for treating the moon in elections. And this is something that we'll see again, as a lot of these magical election rules are directly predicated on non-magical election rules. Our first set involves sect considerations. We're told that if the ritual is to take place during the day, we want the moon to be in a diurnal sign and rising on the ascendant. If at night, we want her to rise on the ascendant in a nocturnal sign instead. There also is a preference in the text for the signs of long ascension over those of short ascension, and I don't really find either of these rules to be very significant, and I would place them super low on the priority list. But the idea of sect consideration is something that I circle back around to when it comes to planets, and this is actually not mentioned in the Picatrix. But basically, I do not recommend doing Mars, Venus, or Moon rituals or petitions during the daytime, and I don't recommend doing petitions for Saturn, Jupiter, or the Sun during the night. Obviously, more significant configurations may override these considerations, but I think it's a good rule of thumb to follow, especially for your typical devotional style ritual work that you may do daily or weekly for a planet. We have some other rules here that come from the 10 afflictions of the moon, like don't put the moon at the end of the signs, which are the bounds of the malefics, or don't put her in the via combusta, or don't have the moon cadent in a chart. These are good rules to keep in mind, but when making certain like fixed star or lunar mansion talismans that are placed along the via combusta or may take up the end of a sign, you will need to break these rules to get those placements that are more important. Book 1, Chapter 5 is our next practical chapter, and this one has information on specific astrological talismans and the astrological configurations that must occur to make them. This chapter is okay, and there's some stuff in here that you could definitely use. The astrology necessary runs from being very simple to then very difficult. There was one talisman I was interested in looking at for overcoming depression and curses, which I thought could, be helpful for a lot of people. But I was not able to find a chart which met all of the conditions that the book listed within the next 7 years, so I kind of just gave up, and we'll just have to do without that one. And that's really all the practical chapters for Book 1. Book 2, Chapter 3 is our next practical chapter, and it is a big one, forming much of the meat of the instruction into the astrological considerations of the entire text. The chapter starts off with a discussion about the powers of the sun and the moon, and how where the moon is in her cycle changes certain aspects of her powers and character in a way reminiscent of other cycles, such as the cycles of the seasons, a life cycle, and the cyclical processes of the four humors, which is all basically straight out of an Aristotelian textbook. We're warned about the effects of eclipses, told about the importance of the ritual space. Basically you're supposed to have an entire house secluded and only used for ritual work to do these spells in. And then we go more in depth about some astrological considerations surrounding the moon. In my opinion, a lot of these lunar considerations listed in Picatrix are unnecessary and are going to make it to where you can really never make an astrological talisman. I'm not going to talk about each and every one of them, but there are a few that I wanted to spotlight. The most important consideration that is listed here is to make sure that the moon is not with the nodes. That is something that you will always want to look out for no matter what. The moon's speed is a good consideration to kind of keep an eye on, but it's probably going to be lower priority in most cases. Picatrix also tells us we should make sure the moon is not averse to or separating from her dispositor or averse to the lot of fortune. And this is where we start to get a lot of plates spinning, and we don't need those, anything more than we can handle. And I haven't ever really cared about the relationship between the moon and her dispositor or her lot, which sound, again, more like general election considerations. From here, the rest of the chapter just sounds like it came straight out of a text on mundane electional astrology, and not surprisingly, Dorotheus is cited by name several times. We're told how the modality of the ascendant sign, whether it's a fixed sign, a cardinal sign, or a mutable sign, affects the operation that we're doing. We're told to heed the 10 judgments of the moon, but we're not told what all of those are. In the Picatrix, presumably we're supposed to already know, or have access to Dorotheus to tell us and fill that blank in, so Picatrix skips over it. We're also given several aphorisms that come straight out of mundane electional procedures that I'm not sure have a place in this kind of ritual electing, such as how the moon and the ascendant can show the beginning of the endeavor and how their lords show the end, and also how the fourth house signifies the outcome, which is a pretty standard electional rule that I actually have never found to be that helpful and gets, in my opinion, way oversimplified and overused in amateur horary astrology. These rules that you would more likely find in a text regarding standard astrological elections have been used contemporarily to create what are called usually something like a house-based talisman. These are talismans that are created with these more extended, we'll say, rules that take more positions in a chart into consideration than kind of a typical talisman would. The idea then is to make a talisman for the timing of this very auspicious election so that you can carry that energy forward with you at a later date. For example, someone might come to an astrologer and ask for an election for the best time to start a business. The astrologer finds a good time for that, and instead of starting the process to open the business, the client decides to make a talisman that then has successful business energy, we're going to call SPE from here on, of that election inside of it. This is different from a more typical planetary, lunar mansion, fixed star, or decan talisman, as it's really a little unclear what spirit exactly is being petitioned. It's different from, say, making a sun talisman and leaning into a lot of those solar qualities that might make a brand successful and well-liked or recognizable. House-based talismans are a little bit more like a good luck charm than, say, empowered spirit vessels that we find in the rest of the text. But let's take a look at those 10 afflictions of the moon and how often I think about them in elections. First, a disclaimer: due to some feline-caused water damage, I no longer have a copy of Dorotheus to quote from. Instead, they will come from Bonatti, which is largely unchanged from Dorotheus's considerations. The first affliction to the moon is when she is combust. There are different measurements for combustion, but I use 7.5 degrees, so when the moon is within 7.5 degrees of the sun, she is afflicted, and we should not make talismans then. I usually expand it to where the moon cannot be in the same sign as the sun, just because that means she would either be super waning or super early in her waxing phase, and I don't like that or find those very helpful. So the first one is a good one, and we should definitely follow it. Check. The second one is if she's in Scorpio or Capricorn. These are, of course, the signs that the moon finds her fall and detriment in, and she does not perform well here, but adhering to this rule will depend on what you're doing. There are lunar mansions and fixed stars that are in Scorpio and Capricorn, so in order to make the talismans for those, you will have to have the moon there. That's just the rule. The moon in these signs could also be useful for Mars or Saturn talismans, but you probably would not want the moon here for, much anything else. The third affliction to the moon is when she is within 12 degrees of the opposition of the sun, so it's sort of like combustion, but just on the other side of the zodiac. And this is an important one and a reminder of how difficult the relationship is between the sun and the moon during the full moon periods, even though we sort of naturally think of them as like supercharged full moons in her own power kind of a time. We sort of lean into her agony when we utilize the full moon, and it's why we're told not to make talismans during both the new and the full moons, as well as because they are sort of awkward phases in her cycle, kind of culmination points with no real momentum behind them. The fourth is when the moon is in a bad aspect with Mars or Saturn. Yes, avoid those at all costs, especially without any kind of reception. The fifth affliction of the moon is to avoid having the moon within 12 degrees of either the north or the south node. Very important. The sixth affliction is when she's in Gemini, as it is the 12th sign from her sign of Cancer. Basically, we would treat this the same that we would with the moon in Capricorn or Scorpio. There are lunar mansions and fixed stars in Gemini, which will require the moon to be here. It is also a good place for the moon to be in during, Mercury talismans or petitions. And I don't really think about the moon in Gemini as an affliction, though, especially not the same way as some of the others. And I do not go out of my way to avoid the moon being placed in this sign. Number 7 is to avoid the moon in the bounds of the malefic planets, and this is kind of an interesting one and kind of an iffy one. Basically, the idea is that the malefic bounds make the moon more unstable and can cause harm, especially to the body, so I don't usually think about this one or try to avoid the ends of signs outside of the context of medical talismans, where the body is, very important. The 8th affliction is when she is in the 8th, 6th, 9th, or 12th houses, as they're either dark or cadent from the ascendant. The 3rd house, which is another cadent house, is usually not included in this list because the moon finds her joy in this house. And this is an important one to manage as best you can. Cadent moons usually manifest as like an inability to seal the deal or land the plane on the talisman's purpose. So it's like they get kind of really close, but then just sort of fumble at the end. This can be mitigated by the moon's application to a well-placed planet, which is usually what you're doing anyways. Affliction number 9 is when the moon is located from 15 degrees Libra to 15 degrees Scorpio. This is a section of the zodiac known as the Via Combusta, and it's regarded as a difficult stretch for the sun and the moon specifically, and I treat this like the moon being in Scorpio or Capricorn. There are fixed stars or mansions that you might want to use here, so she's going to have to be here, and I don't really go out of my way to avoid this one either. And the final affliction of the moon is when she is void of course, and here we are using an older definition wherein the moon is not immediately applying to another planet, and not the more modern where she is not able to perfect an aspect before the end of the sign. This is an important one and will determine how much effort the person is going to have to do to make the talisman work. Obviously, we prefer this to happen as easily and organically as possible with as little difficulty. And that's the 10 afflictions of the moon. They're all useful in their own ways, especially when it comes to thinking about how they might impact the manifestation of the talisman that you are working on. The sign-based and speed-based ones are a little more negotiable just because you might have to put the moon there for your purposes, but the others are really important to keep in mind and work around. Okay, back to the Picatrix. Good night, Bonatti. So that's book 2. Chapter 3. It contains the largest chunk of general election rules. Most of these rules are exact copies, really, from more mundane electional guidelines. You would probably expect some sort of overlap here, as there are really only a couple of ways to augment and strengthen the planets that you want to petition or make talismans for. Other rules, though, are a little overly strict and probably out of place within this context. Dorotheus' text is not a magical one, and it does not seek to engage with planetary energy on this kind of spiritual level. I definitely recommend taking the parts that you can use and leaving what you can't with this, as trying to take all of it will be very overwhelming and will ensure that you will never find a chart satisfactory enough to make a talisman. One of the important ways to make these kinds of decisions is to know what the different rules are trying to accomplish or prevent, and what the effects of not having one present might be in the talisman itself. This is where we get a little outside of the scope of the topic of this video, but lunar speed, which you notice was not actually one of the 10 afflictions, can be an example to show what I mean in this decision-making process. Lunar speed determines how quickly the talisman's effects manifest. The faster the moon, the faster the talisman gets its job done. I don't think this is that important because it's rare that we get more make or break factors in the right places to be able to make a talisman in the first place, that I'm not really going to be picky about how quickly the talisman does what it is made to do. There may be times where lunar speed is very important to me, but usually having a slow runner in the race is better than not participating at all. Our next practical chapter is Book 2, Chapter 6, and it's very short and provides us with 6 whole figures that, when made under the prescribed astrological configurations, can produce certain effects. 3 of these are for pest control, 1 for love, 1 for hate, and 1 to curse a location, just everything a girl could possibly want. Book 2, Chapter 10 is another practical chapter, and this one is actually really important as it records the magical images of the 7 planets, according to several authors. It also describes planetary rings and their powers and wraps up with a list of other miscellaneous talismans for the planets. These are comparatively simple in their election rules, usually just emphasizing some combination of planetary day, hour, angularity, and moon application. This is actually the basis for my own considerations when looking for planetary talismans. I just throw in an extra step to make sure that there is no malefic interference, which the text here does not explicitly say is necessary, but trust me, you will thank me for considering it. The chapter opens with a discussion of the stones and metals that belong to each of the planets, and it's kind of a weird list. The stone correspondences may be more based out of the Yodish tradition, but even then there is not a lot of one-to-one correspondence with the Yodish tradition that I'm familiar with today, and many of the typical planetary associations are actually absent from this list. For instance, we're told that Saturn rules iron, gold, diamonds, onyx, cameo jet, magnesium, and hematite. This is kind of a strange list. The Yodish tradition tends to associate Saturn with blue sapphire, which is notably absent, and Saturn's metal is traditionally noted as lead, not iron, which usually belongs to Mars, but iron is actually not even included in Mars's list, so it's a little out of step with the tradition that we see come about later. Book 2, Chapters 11 and 12 are very similar to one another, and here we're talking about the effects of the 36 decans and their images and talismanic powers. The second half of Chapter 12 also discusses a set of zodiacal-based talismans that are used for healing specific parts of the body. And now you may be familiar with the concept of the Zodiac Man and the idea of the zodiacal signs representing certain parts of the body in kind of like a top-down fashion, with Aries ruling the head, Taurus the neck, and Gemini the arms and shoulders, that kind of thing. Yeah, this is not that in the Picatrix, and many of these talismans and the zodiacal associations with the body don't make a lot of sense compared to this other tradition. For example, the talisman that's prescribed for Taurus is for healing the liver, which is really more in the Virgo area of the body, but the Virgo talisman is for healing the kidneys, which is usually described as a Libra area of the body, and the Libra talisman is for the stomach, so it's just kind of like a weird topsy-turvy place. This chapter might also shed some light on why there are 40 chapters in Picatrix. It says that the Indian sages would fast for 40 days in order to obtain a sort of spiritual enlightenment or purity. In this stage, they would more easily connect with, celestial spirits and more quickly and deeply understand the laws of nature and the stars. So perhaps the 40 chapters of the Picatrix are just an allusion to this specific ritual fast, or the number 40 was chosen to reinforce whatever Quranic reference it was originally made for. The chapter continues to give us a couple more rules for the moon, mostly taking advantage of the planet to whom she is immediately applying to, such as if you want to make a talismans for, love and friendship, do that when the moon is being received by Venus, but if you want to make talismans to make people fight or hate each other, then you should do this when the moon is being when the moon is applying to Mars. It's really easy stuff. This chapter then closes out with discussions of other books by other authors that we do not have access to today. Book 3 actually contains some of the most important chapters in Picatrix. Chapter 1 details the powers and material associations of each of the 7 traditional planets, and this is the list that we refer back to pretty often and see repeated really throughout traditional astrology. But this is in contrast to the list of planetary synthemata that was listed in Book 2, which seemed like it came from a separate tradition that never really caught on. This chapter is really important, but there isn't really a whole lot to say about it because it's literally just lists of planetary things. So go read it, memorize it, understand it. You'll use this information a lot, but you'll find it in pretty much any traditional astrology text. The same thing could be said of Book 3, Chapter 2, which focuses on the signs of the zodiac and their correspondences, including colors, herbs, animals, places, and body parts. The inclusion of the parts of the body here is notable because it agrees with the typical Zodiac Man framework after providing those sign-based talismans earlier, which didn't appear to support or really fit in with that system. We're also treated to the sickest burn that the sign Aquarius signifies humans and all animals whose appearance and form are as ugly and repulsive as the devil's. From this, we can assume 2 things, really. First, that the Picatrix's author's ex-girlfriend was an Aquarius, and 2, that he is not over her. Book 3, Chapter 3 circles back around to discussing the planets. It provides additional images for each as well as some rituals considerations. Like whatever the goal of your ritual is, make sure the planet you are petitioning or making a talisman of can actually help you accomplish that goal. Don't go making Mars talismans for sex, romance, and marriage. He's not going to be able to help you with that. That's going to be more of a Venus role. It also talks about ritual costuming or dressing up like something related to the planet during your ritual. This chapter tackles it through the idea of cloth type and color, focusing on making those match with the planet and providing information on how to do that. Later chapters will approach this unique form of ritual preparation but more like dressing up as something that the planet governs, like dressing up as a king for the sun, a scribe for Mercury, or a dancer for Venus. It then goes on to list some planets you can use for signification to the planets. And I really like the idea of ritual costuming, especially if you kind of update it for modern occupations, because I'm just imagining dressing up for a Mercury talisman and coming in as a DMV employee. From here, the chapter pivots to talking about the decans, more specifically the colors of the decans. And this is actually a section that I'm surprised hasn't gotten more attention than it has, or at least that I'm aware of that it has, because it describes the colors, but also how to make them in inks. And most of it is actually kind of easy to do, with very few having toxic or dangerous ingredients, and maybe only one containing an animal product, so that could be a fun Saturday night project. The chapter wraps up with a discussion about the effects various locations have on people, plants, animals, and stones that are native to those locations, and gives another rundown of planetary effects on the Earth. Chapter 3 is kind of like a hodgepodge of different topics. Book 3, Chapter 4 is one of the weirdest chapters in Picatrix, and we absolutely have to talk about it. It's not what I would call a practical chapter, I hope not, but it is very important. Book 3, Chapter 4 is the shortest chapter in Picatrix, and it reads, "The ancient sages who wrote in their books about mystical knowledge and magic did so as obscurely as possible, such that few or none might benefit from them, except for the wise, and those who study and work with them assiduously. This chapter is placed here more or less frivolously, since it does little to advance our purpose." What the heck was that about? There's kind of another thing that we need to talk about in relation to Picatrix specifically, but also to other occult texts, and it's this idea of hidden, concealed, or coded knowledge. The idea that a text might read one way, but actually mean another, and that hidden meaning may only be revealed to you much later on in your practice, on either through, advanced study, where you just kind of circle back around to it, and those previous passages make more sense now, or perhaps through the guidance of a teacher who spells it out to you once you reach a certain level. The Picatrix mentions this kind of concealment by the ancient authors that it quotes or pulls from fairly often, and these statements are usually followed up by some kind of explanation the author provides, which is great. While there is no doubt that something like this has of course happened throughout history, it's a really kind of romantic notion of this kind of passing information on from one generation to the next in a more structured or ordained kind of lineage system, which of course most occult systems today lack due to breaks in transmission unless they're more modern. This is important to think about and reflect on because it does have some wide-ranging implications for the transmission of this kind of ancient occult knowledge. While there is no doubt that some information only makes sense to someone with, of course, more subject matter knowledge or experience in a field of practice, the idea of information being intentionally concealed or coded can cause some problems for us today as we're trying to kind of recreate or relive some of these occult systems. The first problem is that it creates distrust in the text, and at the extreme means that we can't trust anything that these books tell us. If information is being intentionally concealed so that the uninitiated can't really replicate it, then we're all in trouble because we are all uninitiated, and if that's the case, then we might as well just pack up and go home. For Picatrix specifically, there is this idea that has gained some traction that some of these concoctions detailed within the book use poisonous or dangerous substances in an attempt to intentionally kill and weed out people who don't know any better, and that the learned or experienced would somehow know how to properly handle these substances or know the codes to use those correct non-toxic ingredients. I'm really less inclined to believe this. It just seems like one of those romantic ideas when the more logical conclusion is that this is what we're meant to use and it's just bad. Obviously, chemical safety is important and probably implied, but this idea that there was like a council of wizened elders writing these texts and saying like, well, here we'll have them drink bitter almond juice out of a goblet. That'll teach those posers. That was my beard and pipe. It's just silly and something we don't really have any evidence to support, of course. I also worry that the idea of consciously concealed or coded knowledge creates a bad environment where anyone can basically just say anything about the system or practice and claim that they have, of course, reached or unveiled a true understanding of the messages that are hidden within the text. This line of thinking is potentially borderline delusional, and it's completely invulnerable to any sort of logical or historical counterpoints. Like, how do you argue with it? It's what they say or the highway, and it creates a lot of opportunities for falsities, fantasy, and basically basement occultists to do or say whatever they want in the name of their supposed enlightenment, while anyone who might dare try to speak out or correct them is just one of the unenlightened plebs who needs to get good. It's just not a great place for any sort of philosophical tradition to be. While the Picatrix does talk about how ancient sages concealed knowledge in several places, some of this may actually be invented by the people who translated it from Arabic to Spanish or maybe then to Latin, as a lot of the sections that mention this kind of encoded knowledge are noticeably absent or vastly different in the Arabic version. Book 3, Chapter 4 is a great example of this. In the Latin version, it's a short note reminding us that encoded or concealed knowledge happens, and it's just kind of placed here frivolously as it does nothing to advance our purpose. In Arabic, this chapter details the work of Jafar al-Basri, who developed a system of associating the chapters of the Quran both with planetary rulers and with letters of the Arabic alphabet. It does talk about how to properly handle knowledge and gives us tips like not sharing the information with just anyone, meeting people where they're at so as to not, talk down to them, and not offering valuable information to those who are really not in a position to appreciate it. To me, this presents a different kind of attitude where instead of sometimes these old books only make sense to people who know, wink, it's more like not everyone cares about this as much as you, and maybe you just shouldn't talk about it all the time. Like, get a life, Sean. There is a part in the Arabic version where, after it details some of what I assume is numerology unique to Sufism, as I have no experience with this, that you shouldn't share knowledge with other people. And it's just like, dude, you just wrote all this out for anybody to read, but fine, I'm the problem. This chapter was cut back considerably in the Latin version just because it so heavily focuses on the Quran that there is really no way to successfully update that or bring it into a Christian context. So instead we get this weird little paragraph of a chapter that I think has drawn way too much attention to itself just because of how peculiar it is. Following shortly behind that weird chapter is another really weird chapter that we have to talk about. Book 3, Chapter 5 is the most elaborate example of predatory magic in the Picatrix. I mentioned earlier some of the more questionable of consent involved in many of the rituals or examples in the book, and how we still kind of struggle with the idea of consent in relationship magic today. And this is like the crowning example of it. The Arabic version basically details how a sage used magic to help a man kidnap a younger man from his family home by using what I guess is like magical mind control, which is great, which is creepy, but it's just talked about it like it's an interesting story that the author heard once, like he's telling you a fishing story. The Latin version changes this slightly to where the target of the magic is now a woman because, family values, that's what we're all about here, but that doesn't actually make it any better, of course. The whole scenario is just so blatantly wrong, but the way the book presents it is like low-key bragging about the results that astrological magic can bring. It would be very easy to just kind of dismiss or explain away this and other consent breaches in Picatrix as just kind of products of their time, but I still hear people talking about astrological magic and what it can do in very similar ways. It of course takes a certain kind of person to want to do this, but there are definitely people out there who are happy to just kind of try and take advantage of or influence others for kind of whatever reason. So just kind of be careful out there, and everybody use the buddy system, please. Anyway, this book makes me feel gross, but here I am at almost 10,000 words in about it, so yeah, what does that say about me? So we have one kind of weird chapter, one really gross chapter, and now a good chapter. Ah, yay! Book 3, Chapter 6 discusses a ritual for communing with what the Picatrix refers to as perfect nature. The way the text talks about it makes it seem like a spiritual being, and it may actually be Picatrix's take on the guardian daimon or the guardian angel. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the ritual itself, only that the Picatrix talks about it in being practiced as kind of like an annual ritual, and that it is supposed to be done when the moon is in the first degree of Aries, so you have 12 or 13 times a year that you can do it. I actually think this is a wonderfully helpful ritual and a great alternative for connecting with the guardian daimon for those who are interested or maybe struggling or unable to commit to other ways. The ingredients are also very attainable, which is a plus, so definitely look into that, and it's one of the best chapters in Picatrix, a good example of what the Picatrix can do. The ritual of perfect nature is probably the only ritual that is described within a kind of more theurgic framework, which is why I like it so much. Here we're communing with an aspect of ourselves or with a spiritual helper that is supposed to, help us to attain greater enlightenment or awareness, and probably to overcome something, accomplish something, or maybe even make progress on other spiritual pursuits like life path, figuring out what we're here for, what we're supposed to do. Book 3, Chapter 7 is a very important chapter that provides more information on invoking planetary spirits. This chapter talks more about ritual procedure itself and ritual costuming, now dressing up as something that is like the planet we're trying to invoke, like a sun for the king, a dancer for Venus, a DMV worker for Mercury, and it also provides a few different invocations per planet. This chapter is massively helpful when crafting your own planetary rituals, and helpfully has been published into its own miniature booklet by Christopher Warnock. If you wanted to, pick up this particular section of the Picatrix and leave behind all of the other stuff, you'll definitely use information from this chapter the most in your practice. Our next chapter, Book 3, 8, does a great job of exemplifying the positive side of Picatrix. This chapter talks about alternative prayers for Saturn and the Sun from the Nabateans, which are a nomadic Arabic tribe from the classical period. This section is interesting because it provides us insight into the astrological religious workings of a group of people who are really no longer around as the same political or religious entity. It is this kind of documentation of these rituals and beliefs that I think Picatrix really excels in as a resource. So if we can just have an alternative Picatrix with more forgotten practices of ancient peoples and less predatory magical practices, that would be really great. Thanks. Chapter 9 is another really interesting one, and it starts out by listing the names for the spirits who are said to have control over various planetary motions. It also details planetary rituals that are based not on the position of that planet, but on the sign that the sun is in. For instance, a Saturn ritual for when the sun is in Capricorn, or a Jupiter ritual when the sun is in Pisces. And I think this is actually a really neat way to work with planets, kind of through the vehicle of the sun, and could actually be very useful for Saturn and Jupiter, who are of course away from their signs of domicile for much longer periods of time. Chapters 10 and 11 are our last practical chapters for Book 3, and while they're kind of long, they are filled with recipes and concoctions. You will not use anything from any of these chapters. They are basically just collections of really outlandish and gross ingredients, and we don't have time for this ridiculousness in our very serious survey of the Picatrix. With that, we wrap up Book 3 and move into Book 4 and kind of start to close out of Picatrix, really, as Book 4 doesn't actually have a whole lot of practical information for us to talk about. Chapter 2 is an interesting chapter that records rituals for the moon in different signs of the zodiac. If you remember, just shortly back to Book 3, the 9th chapter there was about a set of rituals for the planets that were set for when the sun entered that planet's sign of domicile. And this chapter is very similar, except they are explicitly lunar lunar rituals that take place while she is full and rising in the sign of the zodiac. And this is a little unusual, as we're kind of generally told to avoid the full moon when we're making astral magical talismans or rituals. And that's one of those 10 considerations of the moon that we were told to heed way back in book 1. Unfortunately, most of these rituals contain some sacrificial component, and the purpose of these rituals are basically kind of wish granting, so you trade a chicken for a wish. The text does tell us the rituals are primarily supposed to be used for love, and it's kind of weird, and it does have a weird story about a ritual gone wrong, where someone didn't do one of these lunar invocations correctly and was basically tormented by a spirit for 40 hours, so there's that 40 number again. And I guess it's just like if the spirit doesn't pick up the phone the first time, don't keep calling. But finally, this chapter closes out with some invocations and characters for the planets that might be useful. I kind of feel like this chapter is really underwhelming, especially since the purpose of all 12 of these rituals is basically, we're told the same. And I felt like the implication was that the lunar spirit that you connect with is supposed to be actually different, based on the sign that the moon is in when they're called. They're even called by different names and they have different symbols, but we don't really get any kind of elaboration on that, so they're all just kind of the same. Book 4, Chapter 4 is actually another really great chapter that I'll probably do a whole separate video on. It's essentially a collection of aphorisms concerning different astrological magic considerations. A lot of the stuff in here is actually pretty basic. It's meant to be, that's really what aphorisms are for. However, there is also some good stuff that's really worth thinking about and starting a conversation about. So look forward to that at some point in the future. The last few chapters in Picatrix are largely useless to our purpose. They are not explicitly astrological in their construction or contents or their symbolism, and they are almost completely recipe or concoction focused, which means we won't be using any of this information. So I'm glad it's here. I'm glad it's taking up space in this very short book. Book 4, Chapter 6 describes recipes for making planetary incense, and while you might think, dear viewer, that you could use these recipes and they would be very useful in augmenting your rituals by having these very cool planetary incenses, you would be wrong. Each of these recipes requires the blood and brains of some animal, and that's just not doable. Like, where am I going to get the blood of a crane at this time of night? If it's not eligible for Amazon Prime shipping, I don't want it. I keep forgetting to wear my hat when I'm talking about spooky things. God damn it. My poor hat. Why even have the witch's hat if I'm not going to wear it all the time? Like, what am I even doing? Chapter 7 contains many more recipes and stories about the abilities of certain magic or like legendary trees or plants. One of the recipes in this chapter that is worth pointing out is a magic mirror that, when inscribed with certain characters and names and done a certain way, is supposed to give one power over people and spirits and the ability to scry. The reason that I want to point this out is because I've actually seen these mirrors offered for sale on a few websites, and while that's fine, do what you gotta do. One of the steps is to anoint the mirror with semen and blood, and that's gonna be like a hard pass for me, and hopefully for you guys as well. That's why I have the spooky hat on. Chapter 8 lists a lot of wondrous, really fake things that sound like they come out of a medieval bestiary. Some of them are actually kind of cool, and I wish half of them were true, but this chapter is just kind of a waste of space, as it doesn't really provide anything to work with here for what we're trying to do. I just want to spotlight a couple of the items in this chapter, because I think they're kind of fun. Our first one, when an owl dies, one of its eyes remain open, while the other remains shut. If you place the closed eye on someone, they will sleep and never be awakened while it remains on them. If you place the open eye on someone, they will never sleep until it is removed. Like, okay, that's not true, but my next favorite is, if a ram encounters a lion, it will at once die a natural death. Right there. Like, yes, because the lion will eat it, and that is definitely natural, but it's not magical or wondrous. Like, why is it in this book? The Picatrix is so magical, you guys. I'm so glad we got it. Our final chapter of the book is kind of a strange one, as it's more of like a combination of 3 separate topics than it has, one unified focus. Like, what's that in this book? The first part talks more about recipes or concoctions for various purposes that are supposedly attributed to Queen Cleopatra. They probably aren't really, and you won't use any of these. And the second kind of section talks about some spiritual aphorisms that were supposedly handed down to us from Socrates and Pythagoras, and while Socrates and Pythagoras probably had as much to do with these as I did, there is some good wisdom to take to heart and to think about. And this is actually where the Arabic Qiyat al-Hakim ends, and it seems like a really kind of a fitting place to do so, just kind of wrapping up with advice to the practitioner and reader about really how to behave and encouraging one to focus more internally. The Latin Picatrix continues a little bit, inserting a separate section on the 28 lunar mansions, which includes some alternative names, suffumigations, and powers associated with each mansion. And then it just stops. It doesn't really end, it just stops. So that's basically it for what the Picatrix contains. Running through this sort of bullet-style list of content, I hope you can see what I mean when I talk about Picatrix being really pretty useless as an instructional text. Once we take its 40 chapters and remove those that we would consider more theoretical, we're down to 23, and then when we remove those practical chapters that focus much more on concoctions than on anything that's astrological, we're left with 18 chapters that have good, actionable, workable content or instruction for our purposes. That's not to say that those theoretical chapters are worthless, but that's not why you're out there recommending the Picatrix to other people. That's not it. There are other books that do a better job of presenting a theoretical and cohesive framework for astral magic than the Picatrix, which suffers from the competing ideas that are present in the work that Picatrix is drawing from, which this book does not ever attempt to reconcile. So fine, Ryan, Picatrix is bad, filled with horrific applications of magic, contradictory information, and more animal brains and guts than you can shake a stick at. What else is there? What should I read now? And this is kind of the annoying part, because there isn't really what I would describe as like a silver bullet book that just completely overshadows the Picatrix. There is a reason why the Picatrix continues to be the most recommended book for astrological magic, and it's all for those goddamn invocations. There is good stuff, it's just buried under all the human excrement potions. We can find almost everything in Picatrix in other places though, and most of the time it's of much higher quality. The first thing I would recommend is that The Secrets of Planetary Ritual booklet by Greer and Warnock. This is basically Picatrix's book 3, chapters 7 and 9 as its own little booklet. These are probably the most important chapters in Picatrix as they contain planetary invocations, which you can and should definitely use in your own ritual. With this book, you basically don't need Picatrix at all and get to just kind of not deal with all of the other gross stuff in it. I also really like this book from a practical standpoint because the words and the text in it, I'm not sure if you can see it, for the prayers are actually in enlarged text, which makes it a lot easier to read during rituals. You can just kind of set it up and read it from afar. So definitely something you should use. Oh, Ficino. Here we go. Secondly, I would encourage you to pick up Marsilio Ficino's 3 books on life, focusing specifically on the 3rd book on obtaining life from the heavens. But the whole book is good. Ficino is much more thoughtful in his application of astrology and magic, and presents it in a much cleaner, cohesive philosophical framework than the Picatrix does. Ficino also provides us with a template for what we would basically come to call nowadays planetary remediation, through a specific application of astral theurgy, which is really fun and not something the Picatrix talks about at all. There is still a good amount of inaccessible or kind of silly things in 3 books on life, unfortunately, but it's less of the whole like using animal brain style and more of the grind up and eat ruby style, which is like, what a flex. But you know, there you go. And if you want to continue exploring the more philosophical branch of astrological magic, I would also recommend picking up Al-Kindi's On the Stellar Rays and C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image, which I mentioned earlier in this video. Some would argue that one of the biggest drawbacks of 3 books on life, or something that keeps them from identifying with it, is the Christian context, which heavily permeates it, but I would counter that, so much of the Picatrix prayers reference God or Allah that it's kind of hard to take this criticism of Ficino too seriously. And then finally, because I told myself I would try to keep it to 3, even though there are like many more really great books out there, I would recommend The Cunning Man's Handbook by Jim Baker. This is an absolutely fabulous book that focuses on folk magical practices in England from 1550 to 1900, so quite a few centuries after Picatrix was written and translated. And I have it right here. Come on, it has 2 really big chapters on astrology and magic, but the whole book is just chock full of really great practical information. So I would recommend any of these books before I would ever think to recommend the Picatrix to somebody, even though I can remember how excited I was to get my copy back in the day when I was an edgy teenager. Now I see Picatrix more for what it is, and kind of how largely useless a lot of the information contained within it is. I also think that it's important for those of us who practice astrological magic to reflect on our relationship with the Picatrix and what it really says about us, maybe individually and as a community, when we see it as the default recommendation, just knowing everything that the book contains. Personally, I would like to see 3 Books on Life become the new default recommendation for astrological magic of any kind. It's a genuinely uplifting book which is filled with interesting and thoughtful information, just aside from the chapter about drinking human blood. Hopefully 3 Books on Life will become more popular now that it is more accessible following a reprint in 2019, this book here. Before that you had to pay like $350 for the out-of-print 1989 edition, which of course I did, obviously, but others were understandably less excited to do so. So there you have it for this video and my opinions of the Picatrix, as well as some of what I think are superior alternatives. And I'm really curious to hear about what others think, especially from those who maybe had a more positive experience with the Picatrix than I did. I would love to hear what your favorite part of the text is, or maybe the part that you find yourself kind of coming back to time and time again. For me, it's gonna have to be that chicken spell. So thank you all so much for watching, and we will see you next time.